All right, this is going to be part 4 in our series on faith. We have said that there's always a reason for faith, there's always a reason for hope. As believers, we understand that our faith is not fantasy driven, it is fact driven. There is evidence for faith. The power of make believe is not what sustains us as believers. So, as we've said, our base scripture is Hebrews 11:1, and it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And we've said that a better understanding of that verse is, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the validation of our faith being that which has already been accomplished and even now is still being accomplished. And these things are not casually observed. First of all, the writer is not saying that there isn't anything to be seen, nor that you can't see it. He's saying that there is a way to see it. So in part 2, we talked about the commandment to see, that God commands us to see. And we looked at in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. And then in part 3, we talked about the cost of not seeing. So now we're back in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And what we said is that the writer is legally defining faith. He's given a legal textbook definition for what faith is. And as a result, that makes it a pun. It's a play on words. Why? Because faith and law cancel each other out. So again, we've said that it is a play on words. The very definition itself is a play on words, containing several smaller plays on words, all of which get lost in translation. Hence, statements like this. So now let's go through the definition. So the first play on words is the word faith itself. And it has to do with how the writer uses the word in earlier parts of the letter. The first time the writer uses the word faith is in chapter 4, verse 2. And he uses it subjectively, meaning that my faith can be informed, impacted, and influenced by how I see it. In other words, my perspective. And if my perspective is off, then my faith will be off. So again, in part 2, we showed how God established for man what the proper perspective should be. Now here's how we define perspective. Perspective is how one sees, views, understands, organizes, and responds to life, especially when under pressure. Now when we say views, that includes feelings and emotions. Why? Because how I feel about something is going to impact and affect how I respond to it. Now let's read what it says in chapter 4, verse 2. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. So he's talking about their response to the word. We've said that faith does not require us to go against reason and logic. It does require us to go against fear, doubt, and unbelief. And their response was unbelief. Their response was fear and doubt. Remember, we've said that there is a cost to not seeing it, and they are about to pay a tremendous cost. The word was enter in and take possession of the land. They didn't believe. Why? Because their perspective is off. They're looking at the problem. They're not looking at God. Remember, in part 2, we said that God established himself as the prism, Prism, the prism through which we are to view life, which we are to see life, we are to understand life, and we are to do life. We are to see his divine person, his purpose, His promise and his provision in every situation. Now, here is the other thing I want us to see from that passage, and that is this: that faith will always require and even demand a response from us. The day you hear my voice, harden not your heart. Faith will always require and even demand a response. And no response is still a response. We don't get to be neutral. So again, the first time the writer uses the word faith is in chapter 4, verse 2. And he uses it subjectively, meaning that our faith can be informed, impacted, and influenced by how we see it, by our perspective. And if our perspective is off, then our faith will be off. And we must now adjust. Now, before we move on, here's the other thing I want us to see. Chapter 4, verse 3. This is what he says. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. In other words, the foundation and the evidence for our faith is found in the foundation of the world. From the very beginning, God gave us evidence to believe. Now, the second time that the writer uses the word faith is in chapter 6, verse 1, and he uses it objectively. First time he uses it, he uses it subjectively, meaning that it matters how I see it. Second time he uses it objectively, meaning regardless of how I see it, it is what it is. And again, if I don't see it for what it is, then my perspective will be off and my faith will be off. Remember, when God commanded us to see, we said, number one, we are commanded to see. There is something to see. We are expected to see it. In other words, we don't have an excuse for not seeing it. We are held accountable for understanding what we are seeing, its nature and its purpose. We have to see it for what it is, not what we wish it to be. And then number 5, there's a cost to not seeing it. So again, he uses it objectively the second time, meaning that it is what it is. And I must see it for what it is, or else my perspective will be off and my faith will be off. Listen, he uses it objectively, and he uses it in direct reference to the person of God. The first time he used it in reference to the word of God. Now he's using it directly to the person of God, meaning that God is God, and I must see him as God. And if I don't see him as God, then my perspective is off. Also, here's what he's getting at, that God is the object of true faith, not what we want, not our desires. It is God himself who is the object of our faith. Remember, there's always a reason for faith. There's always a reason for hope, because our faith is in him. Our faith is not fantasy driven. We'll pick this up in part 5.